Today, we're going to be talking about music, how it weaves through our lives, how it impacts memories. You know, I can't drive in a car without having the song Sarah by Fleetwood Mac get me teary. And when I mention this to my now 25-year-old daughter and say, oh, this song reminds me of you, as I'm bawling a little and she's sitting next to me, she laughs and she says, Mom, that's an Instagram meme. Everybody's mother says to their daughter. So, okay, there's something there. And today we're going to explore that. While the song Sarah was not on the album Rumours, a lot of other mega hits were. Songs like You Make Loving Fun, Go Your Own Way, Dreams, Don't Stop, Secondhand News. Well, my guest today, Alan Light, is a writer, and he took on the challenge of writing the book, Don't Stop, Why We Still Love Fleetwood Mac's Rumours. Thank you, Alan.
Hi, Diane. Thank you. Happy to be here.
Why do we still love Fleetwood Mac's Rumours?
Well, you're going straight in for a big swing. So, well, I guess let me back it up a little. At least get to some context for why even ask the question, or why this is a thing to seem worthy of exploring. And what I have learned in the books that I have written over the last whatever number of years. I came up in magazine world. I started my life at Rolling Stone. I was the editor of Vibe magazine, of Spin magazine, launched another magazine of my own that ran for a while, and then I had to shut down, and then shifted into other ways of telling these stories, and have been writing, largely focusing on writing books for the last 15 years or so, as well as a long run on Sirius XM and other things that I have done in
Tell us some of the titles of your other books.
Well, what's relevant here is what I have learned from some of those books is that what I really like doing is looking sort of very close focus at a project, a moment, something that was transformative in the culture, or that had some other unexpected afterlife, some other impact, and looking at that story and then at that legacy. Those are the stories that I find myself interested in, rather than big comprehensive, even when I'm reading big biographies, I read, and then when he was a sophomore in high school, and I don't really care that much. And that's not the book that I really want to write. So among the books that I've written, I wrote a book about the song Hallelujah, called The Holy or the Broken, Leonard, Cohen, Jeff Buckley, and the unexpected Ascent of Hallelujah.
That was the song I hummed to my daughter nursing her when she was a baby.
There you go. Everybody has a story. So that was a fantastic exercise, project, learning thing for me, to really look at how did that song really start from less than nowhere and become one of the best loved, best known anthems around the world.
Wasn't that in Shrek?
It was in Shrek. That was a very significant moment in the progression of this story. So I did that, and then we developed that. That was that later adapted into a documentary that did very well, and so that was great. I wrote a book about Prince and Purple Rain. I did a lot of work with Prince when he was alive, but looking at that project and how that translated different things, different themes in his life and his work, and then became, the first time anybody had a #1 single and album and film at the same time. So I like those kinds of things. And I sort of idly noticed a few years back when my son was still in high school, that it just seemed like Rumours was the one, classic rock album that all of his friends knew and had some sort of relationship to. Everything else from that era was old, was not relevant to them, was not something they cared about. Even Born to Run or Dark Side of the Moon or Hotel California or the other sort of comparably massive records of the mid-70s. But they all seemed to, I don't know, one was wearing the t-shirt, or when they were over at the apartment, they would listen to it. And I remember talking to him and just saying, like, so Rumours is really the one thing that they all, and he's like, oh yeah, everybody knows. Everybody knows that. Everybody listens to that. And I got really interested in this. Why is it the one exception to this rule? This album is, at that point, was, over 40 years old. It's soon coming up on 50 years old.
Oh boy.
But if you look at the Billboard album charts right now it's in the top 30. 2 weeks ago, it was in the top 20. It was number 15.
Are you kidding?
Right now, right today, on the album charts, in between the Taylor Swift album and the Ed Sheeran album, or whatever.
That's
it is.
unbelievable.
And there is nothing close. There are no other catalog records anywhere near that. And then when you start to get other older records, they're sort of all greatest hits records. Queen's greatest hits, Elton John's greatest hits. But that's about a song. That's, or a song or two. It is not about an album as a project. And then I started to think about, okay, what are all these places that it continues to reappear in the culture? There was the All Rumours episode of Glee. There was, of course, you said, your daughter says, it has become a TikTok staple repeatedly. There was, if you remember, the guy on the skateboard drinking from the cranberry juice bottle in the early days of lockdown, that became a huge phenomenon and sort of a formative moment for the TikTok platform, the way that took off.
And as the mother of a skateboarder, we watched that one a few times.
Sure, that is true. So, there was Daisy Jones and the Six, the book. There was Daisy Jones and the Six, the TV series. And so thinking about, there's a reason that it continues to recur. There's a reason that, people continue to discover it sort of on their own terms and in their own place. And that seemed like something that was worth exploring to see, what is that all about? I didn't really want to make so much a making of Rumor. And, look, the Making of Rumours is the greatest soap opera in the history of rock and roll. These are three couples, all of whom simultaneously breaking up, in terrible relationships with each other, and yet showing up at the studio every day, writing songs about each other and recording them together. It's the craziest thing, ever, of all time. So, so I started to look into it. And as I started to dig into some of the data and see, it's 2 years ago, the most streamed album of the 20th century on Spotify, more than any Beatles album, more than Nirvana, more than any of the things that you might think are the ones that stay popular. Rumours is way ahead of them. Last year, Dreams was the most streamed song from the 1970s on Spotify. Again, it is parked in the top 20, 30 of the album chart week after week after week. If you look at the vinyl chart, which is mostly kids buying records at Urban Outfitters and mostly to put on their shelves or hang on the wall, the top 10 is 5 Taylor Swift albums. And then, Harry Styles, Chappell Roan, Rumours, Sabrina Carpenter, whoever. It is the one record from that era that continues to attract young listeners obsessively year after year after year. So that was what I wanted to explore in the book. That was what I wanted to look at, is what is it? And so I spoke to 30 some post-millennials about their relationship to the record, how they found it, what it means to them. I am not going to go through the full, here's what, I think there's a number of things that line up. I think that the gender composition of the band is really important. I think that they can relate to a band with 2 female singers and songwriters fronting this band in a very different way than if they look at the Eagles and see 5 guys with long hair and 5 white guys with long hair and guitars is very much their parents' construct of a band. I think if you look at the fact that there are 3 lead singers in this sort of round robin rotation, It's different perspectives, it's different points of view. For kids who maybe didn't grow up listening to albums, it plays much more like a playlist because it's continually shifting and there's this variety to it. I think
I often think about that. You know, the slaving of the album and the order they put those songs in is very interesting.
Absolutely. And very different than listening to one guy singing at you for 45 minutes. Yeah. It's a very different experience. And the themes of, sort of beginning, middle, end, afterlife of a relationship are such eternal, universal themes. It's very interesting, not to just sort of spill all this, but if you sat down on December 31st, 1979 with the music industry intelligentsia and said, okay, here are the 5 biggest albums of the decade. And it's Born to Run, Dark Side of the Moon, Led Zeppelin 4, Hotel California, Rumours. 50 years from now, which are kids still going to care about? Not one person would have said Rumours.
Yeah.
They would have said all those others are big, important commentary, statement records. That's, those are the things that will live. And Rumours is great, but it's kind of a pop record and whatever. And the reality is all of those records feel a little bit dated, a little bit of their moment, where there is something that I think is eternal and eternally youthful about Rumours in the intensity of its emotion that, obviously continues to draw this attention year after year and generation after generation. So that's what the book is.
It wasn't just in, let's say, the lyrics or the singing. When I think of the drumming in those songs, I mean, drumming is so primal, and it's a real key thing in Fleetwood Mac songs and in that album.
The sound of all of the record is so unique.
Yeah.
And particularly, I think the rhythm section.
Yeah.
I mean, look, all of it. Lindsay Buckingham is a magnificent guitar player who really doesn't play like anybody else. Stevie is obviously the singer and figure and icon that she is. Christine McVie is so underrated as a songwriter and as a hit factory for that band. But also it is rooted in what Mick Fleetwood and John McVie, on drums and bass are doing that. Primal, I think, is very much the right word. Mick is not a flashy drummer. He is not, but he is a propulsive and there is a thump, a drive to what those songs sound like that, give them a real, give them a force and give them a power. Even the quieter stuff that doesn't feel like anything else. Mm-hmm. I think that's absolutely right.
When I'm just curious, when you started to talk, I'm sure you used your son and his friend group for just a little insight. Did kids relay anything different to you than what you heard from adults when they spoke about this?
Yeah, I think absolutely yes. And I think that to me, the biggest difference was, I think for those of us who grew up with this album in real time, mm-hmm. I think that you first look at it through the lens of the anger. You think of it as a breakup album. Anytime there's a poll survey of greatest breakups albums of all time, Rumours pins the number 1 spot. Then you get to, Adele, Frank Sinatra, whatever it is. But, that really became such a defining identity for this album. But it quickly became apparent to me that if you were born 20 years after this album was recorded or more, that really wasn't the way that you defined Rumours. That yes, that was part of it, but there were so many of these kids who said to me, I would never think of it as a breakup album. It isn't something I would turn to at that time. It's an album I listen to when I'm getting ready for school in the morning, or when I'm going out running, or before I go out with my friends. And I think that they can much more clearly hear the range mm-hmm. of what's going on at Rumours, because it is 3 singers, 3 songwriters at different stages of their relationship and the end of their relationship. Mm-hmm. And it is just as much You Make Love and Fun and the beginning of a relationship as it is Go Your Own Way and the sort of hostility of the end of a relationship, as it is Songbird and the sort of love that may not even be romantic love, but maybe sort of friendship love, but is about, intimacy, as it is The Chain, which is saying that like these never end. These people are always a part of your life, sort of like it or not. I think that they can hear all of that much more clearly than those of us who grew up with the story of the soap opera, the breakups, Stevie writing about Lindsay, Lindsay writing about Stevie. We can't really separate that out, but I think that they can. And in that way, I heard a very different relationship to what's happening in these songs than I think how you and I approach this album. And I think the other thing is, sort of what we were saying before, that there are these if you grow up in a Bruce Springsteen household, there is a day when you are handed Born to Run and told, this is important, you need to understand this, you need to listen to it. And there's really no chance that you're going to develop your own relationship to that album. It is something that is so handed down from on high. And I think because Rumours wasn't given that same sort of gravity, that same sort of respect, which has only accelerated over the years. I mean, every time Rolling Stone does their list of the 100 greatest albums of all time, Rumours goes up 20 spots every time. Everything else drops over time, appropriately. It's further away and there's new stuff. Rumours, the first time they did that list was like number 78 on that list. The last time they did that list, it was number 7. But because it doesn't have that same, because it wasn't given that same sort of critical respect in the same way, I think there's much more space for other subsequent generations to kind of find it on their own and develop their own relationship to and understanding of it. I mean, pretty much everybody that I spoke to said, yeah, of course I had heard it growing up. Of course my parents had it. It was in the house. But it was later when I found it and I could figure out what it meant to me that it became so important in my life. And I think it had an opportunity and a space to do that some of its other sort of peers, really didn't have a chance to do that.
It's funny. I remember being in high school when Rumours came out, and there were the people who just loved that album. I wasn't one of them. I was like in the Queen, David Bowie sections, and Rumours was like, what is going on over here? No. But in retrospect, when I started listening to it, I remember thinking, wow, it was kind of like Tom Petty. I went to a Tom Petty concert one time, and I was never into Tom Petty. And I sat there saying, this guy has a lot of hits. Man, I knew every single song that he was playing. And I had never purchased a Tom Petty album. And when I look back at Rumours, you look back and you say, holy, what didn't become a hit on this? Did anything not make the top at least 20?
It was the first time that an album had 4 songs reach the top 10.
That's
the first time that happened. And it came out the same year, within a few months. It's just interesting to think about that Star Wars came out and kind of redefined blockbuster album not the same way, but in a way that Star Wars was redefining blockbuster movie. That whatever it is about 1977, everything's just kind of, scaling up and things are getting bigger and bigger. But yeah, The Chain was not a single from that album. The Chain is the second most streamed song now from Rumours. It has become such a beloved, such a, central part of that record. And that wasn't even a single. It got huge radio play to your point, but there were 4 songs that reached the top 10 from Rumours. So look, it is funny it's one of the 10 biggest selling albums of all time. It is hard to make any case that Rumours is underrated. It's a very different, when I was doing the Hallelujah book, this was when Leonard Cohen turned in the album with Hallelujah on it, his label rejected it. That's a song that came from forget under the radar. It was nowhere near the radar.
Oh my
and then
gosh.
took over the world over the course of a bunch of decades. That's a different story than Rumours, which was, massive and beloved from day one. But I do think, again, has this place all its own in this, continuing legacy of pop music that does continue to evolve, continue to shift, and continue to resonate.
I'm curious. You have been writing about music. A little shift here. You've been writing about music pretty much, as I can tell, your whole life.
Yes.
And so therefore you're an archive of knowledge. You have interviewed some of the most interesting people between Rolling Stone and Spin magazine, which I loved. I was really always sorry Spin left the planet. That was one of my favorites. And your books. What is from your experience, psychologically, and I know you're not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but there's a music tie-in to our psyche. So that's how I mean it. What do you see and observe is the tie-in with these things that become so near and dear to us and psyche as you talk with people?
I don't know that there's a single universal answer to that, but clearly there is there is the ability to distill and clarify emotion, and speak, truths that people can identify and recognize in ways that I don't know that we can ever understand, right? I mean, what is it? I don't know what it is. You mentioned Tom Petty before, and I think Tom Petty is an really, really interesting example, because Tom Petty to me is somebody who I think is only going to grow in esteem as time goes on, because it was just what you said. The stuff that he did was so deceptively, I don't know if you say it was deceptively simple or deceptively complicated. Easy, simple language, simple hooks. It was not literary in the way that a Bob Dylan or a Bruce Springsteen, and I love those guys more than anything. But there's something a little bit intimidating about guys like that who are these, complicated songwriters. Petty would listen to, and you would think, yeah, I could have written that. Except there is no way you could have written that. Right? He did it in so few words, in such simple language, and you just looked at it and were like, yeah, he wrote a bunch of hits. And then you go back to them and you're like, oh my God, this stuff is like it's so powerful, and it's so precise, and it says exactly what it means in ways that people can identify, see themselves, see their lives. And I just think that's going to only gain in respect and an impact. I mean, right now, everybody in Nashville wants to write like Tom Petty. Every country singer will tell you that's the guy.
A lot of Tom Petty songs, you don't necessarily know what the words are unless you're looking at liner notes, which are a sad thing. We don't get, to study for hours like we did as kids. But, some of his songs, because of how his raspy voice, you couldn't necessarily understand the words. Well, I was driving one day on a long trip by myself, flipping the radio dial, singing badly, and Poison's version of I Need to Know came on the radio.
Okay.
And it was sung very crisply. And I'm like, oh my gosh, these lyrics are incredible.
When I am asked, as a thing that comes up, what is the best first line to a song, I do not think there is a better first line to a song than "She was an American girl raised on promises." That is an epic poem in 7 words. I mean, it's just, I can't fathom writing something like that. And I think that Rumours has some of that same power. These are not, I mean, Stevie Nicks does what she does. It's the White Witch. It's the mystic imagery. It's the, crystal mystic visions. It's all of that stuff. And that is what people love her for. But particularly the Christine McVie songs, there is a directness to it that I think, again, people can find themselves in what is being expressed there. I mean, look, the thing that I will always love about pop music, just pure pop music, is people act like, oh, they can just make it up it's just a formula. They know what works and they can just dial it in and they can do it. If that were true, they'd never miss.
Mm-hmm.
They'd figure out the formula, they'd do it in a lab, and they miss 9 times out of 10. They almost always miss. And there is something where kids look at it and go, no, not that one. No, that one. And it isn't necessarily not necessarily the best singer. It's not necessarily the best dancer. It's not necessarily the best looking. It's whatever it is, there is a magic to it that the audience responds, the audience reacts. And you can't guess and you can't be sure. And I will always love that. I will always love trying to figure out why that one and not those other 4 that preceded. So, there are things you can say as abstractions. These are the things that people respond to. I wrote the book and spend a lot of time talking about Leonard Cohen. I'm teaching a class about Hallelujah right now as we speak. It remains a story. When you're talking about a writer like Leonard Cohen, it is so easy to get lost in just the words.
Mm-hmm.
He started as a poet. He was a novelist. We're going to talk about this language. We're going to talk about this imagery. But if people don't respond to a melody, if they don't respond to a hook that they want to hear or they want to sing, nobody cares. Nobody's going to listen to that. Nobody's going to listen to it just to listen to words if they don't want to hear a song. So I have to, even there, I have to constantly remind myself, like, yeah, we can spend a lot of time talking about all the lyrics here, but what's going on in the song? What is happening in the melody? What is happening in the marriage of those words to a thing that people want to listen to and want to sing? Because that has to be there first. That always has to be there first.
That's such an interesting point, because I always often think about, you've got an Elton John and a Bernie Taupin, and one bought one bought another, or Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, or Nikki Sixx and everybody in Motley Crue. Somebody brings something and everybody else brings some. It's such a fascinating orchestration of talent. And do you have any beliefs on what leads?
Well, those are all very different. I mean, the Elton John and Bernie Taupin thing is so fascinating, right? Because, I guess that there were Broadway teams that worked that way, where one strictly wrote the words and then one strictly turned them into songs. But it's really, that is such a hard thing to imagine, that Bernie sends over sheets of lyrics and then Elton figures out what to do with them and turns them into these songs that we love, forever and ever. That's so different than the, Mick and Keith sitting together and banging out a song together, and one, sort of editing and guiding the other, and Keith bringing his Chuck Berry chords to, whatever it is. That dynamic, those relationships, I don't think there are rules to how any of that works. Obviously that, those pairs, whether it's Page and Plant, Mick and Keith, John and Paul, like those define so much of what we think of as rock and roll. But Fleetwood Mac didn't work that way. These were really writers working in separate lanes. But what is really interesting is to think about, even at the worst moments of the Stevie and Lindsay relationship, even in the middle of them breaking up in the middle of Rumours and really just furious at each other, whatever is going on, Stevie knew whatever crazy mind meld they had, Lindsay was the one guy who understood her writing and understood how to make them into great records. Christine McVie tells a story that Stevie came and presented Dreams when she first wrote it. And Christine was like, this is so boring. This has 2 chords. It has 6 verses. It goes on forever. Nothing happens. Why would we record this? And then Stevie gave it to Lindsay. And he went off and did what he does. He figured out the arrangement. He figured out the washes of guitars, the little bit of the sort of marimba. He found a structure for it. He found a way to put this thing together, turned it from here's a thing that Stevie made into this is what a record of that would sound like. Came back and Christine was like, oh my God, that's a huge hit. Like, of course we're going to record that. And it is the one and only Fleetwood Mac song that went to #1 on the charts. Dreams is the only #1 hit that they ever had. But it's so interesting to think that even as they could barely talk to each other, Stevie knew, look, he's still got to be the guy who works on these songs and gives them the shape that I can hear, but I don't know how to do. So, that whatever it is that creates this, explosion, even as much as Fleetwood Mac with these multiple writers working in their own lanes still needed some of that, some of that spark to be able to get to, what these songs really were.
As you worked on this book, were there any particular wow or surprise moments where you uncovered something that it's just like, wow, that's an eye-opener?
I think there were a lot of, so the way I sort of structured the book in 3 parts. And the first part is kind of setting up, first of all, here's the phenomenon that this record is, here's why we're doing this, some history of the band leading up to Rumours, and then sort of quickly going through the concise version of the Rumours sessions and all the craziness about it. The middle of the book, I go through song by song, all of the songs on the album. And what that really was a chance. I knew that there were a lot of different stories that I wanted to tell. Some of those were really dreams. I wanted to tell the guy on the skateboard, cranberry juice story, what that meant for TikTok, what that meant for, in the moment. Like, okay, that goes there. There was one moment I wanted to talk about the Glee episode. A lot of the kids that I talked to of the right age really did discover the album through that. And they all kind of talked about the song Never Going Back Again and the way that was staged. It's sort of the big production number. It's a small song. You wouldn't think of it, but it's a big number. They all kind of referenced that. So, okay, I could do the Glee and what he did with that song attached to that song. Great. So about half of those were really easy. About a quarter of what was left was kind of pretty easy because I knew there were themes. The song Oh Daddy is Christine writing about Mick Fleetwood as the sort of father figure in the band and as the one actual father in the band. And so to your point earlier, talking about the rhythm section, talking about the role that he played, he was managing the band at that time, what he was bringing as a musician, but as a force, like that can go there. But the thing about committing to, I'm doing this for every song means I got to come up with something for every song. So the last couple were a little bit like, all right, is there something I can do with this one? Like, what's the right, but I, was able to jerry rig all of that together and find it. And then the last section of the book is really where mostly talking to all these kids, younger artists, younger producers, sort of, okay, why, so what is this all about? And how does it work? How does it live in the world today? What is it that they are reacting to? What sort of explore all of that stuff. So there were, I don't know that there was a big, who knew, but I think the chance to dig into each of those stories, both here's what the song is, here's how it worked when they were making it, and then here's how it worked in this other place in the world. I Don't Want to Know, kind of a throwaway song a little bit, was used as the punchline in a Saturday Night Live skit when Paul Rudd was a guest, in 2005. And I was like, well, how did that, do people even know that song? It isn't like it was a hit. Again, it's 30 years after the album came out. So I figured out who wrote that sketch and went and talked to her about did anybody say, why are we doing this? Did anybody say use a song people know? But, she said, no, everybody got what that was. And it played great in rehearsal and it played great in the room. So that was sort of fun to look at. Interesting to think about Secondhand News as the opening song on this album, because it's such a kind of little song. It's an acoustic based,
Mhm.
and if you think about all the other sort of blockbuster albums, Appetite for Destruction opens with Welcome to the Jungle. And Hotel California opens with, well, Hotel California. And Thriller opens with Wanna Be Starting Something. And Zeppelin 4 opens with Rock and Roll. Like, they're all big mission statements. We're coming in super hot songs. And this is the furthest away from that. So it was a chance that was one that I kind of had to figure out what I want to do with, because it's never really been used in the world. But I liked looking at, okay, so why does it work in a completely different way than any of the other things that are, if you look at all the other top 10 best-selling albums, none of them open with something as sort of understated. Secondhand News fades in. It's like an old Beatles trick. Like you're coming in the middle of something, but it isn't, I don't know which song on Rumours would have been that, but it's certainly not that. So that was a way to think about, sort of structurally how that worked. Yeah. So they were all, they all had surprises. They all had interesting things to sort of dig into in their way.
Now, since you went back to the 70s to write this book, what's your take on music now? Is there anybody right now in music that you would tackle a book on?
Well, I mean, I think it's, as this record shows, I think it is a fool's game to pretend 50 years from now, here's what people are going to be listening to. Like we don't know. The world changes, the culture changes, the music changes. We live in a world, again, that is now, so the pop world is so overwhelmingly defined by female artists now in a way that was unimaginable in the 70s, right? Now it is entirely Taylor and Beyonce and Sabrina and Billie Eilish and Olivia Rodrigo. They are leading what pop music is in a way that is so different from where things were, decades ago. So,
go ahead.
Yeah. No, so it's very difficult to play that game of, what's going to continue to resonate. Said, like, if you look at the streams, no, they're just not. They don't listen. These albums that we think of as they were massive, blockbuster, hugely important records. And then you go look at the streams and like nobody's listening to so many of those 70s classic records. So I think that's difficult. Look, would I take on a book? I am a huge Taylor Swift fan from, if not day one, very early on. I think there is, no end to the things to look at and talk about when you're talking about an artist of that sort of impact and that sort of magnitude, who I think is great. But it's a very different thing writing that in the middle of when it is happening,
right?
Without a sense of legacy, it's just a different sort of a project to do that's changing sort of underfoot day to day as you're looking at it. I think a lot of those figures are really interesting, and I would happily roll up my sleeves and spend some time thinking about them. But that's a different sort of a thing to tackle.
I'm just curious, in your history of working in music during your time frame, what do you think was the shift that went from bands to more like this individual artist kind of thing?
That's it's a very perceptive thing to notice, because there's a guy who is he's a record executive, but he does a sort of a big newsletter at the end of the year of, thoughts on the year and his favorite songs and whatever it is. And I remember like 2 years ago, he did a thing that was like, okay, this year in the top 100 songs of the year, there are 0 groups. 0. Like the year before there were 2. It's gone up a little bit because of the K-pop stuff. It's actually gone up a little bit since then. That's sort of brought, a little more of that kind of energy, that sort of structure back. One of his theories for the reason for that really dramatic drop off was, if TikTok really is sort of steering the ship, it's really built for the cameras here on your face. It's really complicated to do that when it's 4 people. Like that medium doesn't really lend itself to a group structure. It's designed really to be a one-on-one thing. And he was positing that this, sort of rapid decline had a lot to do with that, with the way that people discover this stuff and consume it, and that's how they're used to looking at it, and that's how it's delivered. That may be true. So I don't know. I mean, obviously the rock band construct, and there was that also this past year, to give credit, there was a bit of a resurgence of young rock bands. I don't know how much you're keeping up with these bands, like, Turnstile and Sleep Token. These guys had number one. I mean, number one album doesn't mean what it used to, but it still means bigger than anything else that week. Yeah. And there actually were a number of younger rock bands who did have significant releases this year. Is that a fluke? Is that something that's going to last? Is there going to be a resurgence in that? We'll see what shakes out. But even if you look at like Grammy nominations this year, for whatever they mean, those bands were getting that sort of notice in a way that I think is at least worth paying attention to. But you're absolutely right that there was a tectonic shift from bands to solo acts as the powerhouse in where pop music is. It's
to me, it's such a loss to music. And I had a really keen insight when in 2019, last minute, like 3:30 in the afternoon, I found 2 reasonably priced tickets to the Rolling Stones, and it was 2019, and it was right before everything, whatever. Yes. But I said to my daughter, "You want to go?" And at the time she was, I guess, 21. And she's like, "Sure,
let me see it."
And we're sitting there, and she's just like, "This is unbelievable." She goes,
I didn't know you could do this.
I wish there were bands like this now. This is a band. This is like, because you could zoom in on each person, and they were like, Keith Richards was doing his thing. My groin still hurts from the high kick Ronnie Wood did.
And look, a Stones concert can kind of
in its own world. It was mesmerizing to watch everybody.
And the beautiful, a Stones concert can still kind of go off the rails. There are still moments where you're like, they kind of got lost in that one, or one goes this way and one goes that way. I mean, one answer you have to give is technology has changed in a way that, you don't, that was the only way to make those sounds when they were doing that. And machines can do a lot of different things. You can record on this laptop in a way that was more sophisticated, than the studios those guys were recording in, decades ago. So it just doesn't require, that's not the only way to be able to create. And that's neither good nor bad. Everything is just tools. Everything is more stuff to work with. And then it's, what do you do with them? But, that has to be obviously addressed. And as we move into, not to go all the way there, but more of an AI world, and the ability to, you don't need an orchestra. You need to hire an orchestra to put an orchestral part on a song that you're making. You can punch that in and say, give me an orchestral arrangement that goes with this song. Those should only be good. Those should only spark creativity. Having the access to those kinds of things makes it much more open to, a full spectrum of sounds, of possibilities, of doing things that otherwise you just don't have the budget and the opportunity to do. So that's the upside of what, where we are right now. And again, those, also I think, back to the Fleetwood Mac point, I think that a lot of kids in a more, gender aware, diversity aware generation look at those bands and see a bunch of old white guys. Like, that's what the construct of those bands, overwhelmingly 90 whatever % of them were. Sometimes you got a chick singer, sometimes. It's why Fleetwood Mac really does stand out, because again, there's 2 women. They were both writing. They were presented as allies, not rivals. A lot of people that I spoke to, a lot of the kids that I spoke to, talked about that, seeming that friendship, and that, what the relationship between Stevie and Christine was, as something that they really took inspiration from, modeled, from, and there really aren't what other bands can do that. The only ones like Heart, Sisters,
Yeah.
and the B-52s, God love them, were the only sort of bigger bands like that I can think of with more than one woman, in the front line of the band. So I do think that, getting out from under the shadow of that, rock's greatest generation, 60s and 70s bands that are all these dudes, so many of these, I say kids, they were sort of 16 to 30. They're not all kids. But they looked at them and like, yeah, it's kind of got nothing to do with me when I look at those groups. It's not to take away from what they did, but I don't think that they could easily relate to that.
That is this whole interview has been interesting. And I wish we weren't at the end, Alan, because I really feel like I could ask you about a zillion more questions. So we're going to have to do this again, I have a feeling.
You know where to find me, Diane. I'm happy to be of service wherever it takes us.
Really great interview, everybody. I'm Dian Grissel. I'm also known as Silver Disobedience. This has been the Silver Disobedience Perception Dynamics podcast. My guest today has been Alan Light. There are going to be all kinds of links to his books below because he's written quite a few interesting ones. You'll be able to find more about him in his articles and everything else. And I highly recommend you share this, pick up a copy of his new book, which is Don't Stop, Why We Still Love Fleetwood Mac's Rumours After All These Years. And his other one, I'm going to read that Prince one too. I think we're going to find some really good stories here.
And that's the beautiful thing about books is they stay out there.
I love that about books.
The newspapers and magazines, they're fish wrapped the next day. We know that, but the books are there to be discovered whenever it's the right time.
That's it. Discover, give them as presents to friends. Everybody loves music, and these are some great stories. So again, thank you, everybody. Hit subscribe and share this with your friends because it's an inspiring episode as usual, full of lots of great perceptions and perspectives. Thank you, Alan.
Alan, we're moving over to the green room. Me down, Diane. Happy to do it.